Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on understanding the new Cali Fund and what it means for biotech companies' use of digital sequence information. I'm Linda Bedenick, Senior Policy Manager at the Bioindustry Association, and thank you very much for joining us today. So the governance of digital sequence information on genetic resources globally has been a complex topic for many years, and we will today use the session to untangle this for UK biotechs. I'm delighted to be joined today by Katie Beckett, who leads on the Nagoya Protocol and Digital Sequence Information Policy at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as Bart van Voren, who is partner at Covington and the private sector representative of the Steering Committee for Digital Sequence Information at the Convention on Biological Diversity. So today we'll hear firsthand insights from Katie and Bart on what the new mechanism and fund for DSI is and how it came about, what it means for UK business and how it relates to and is different from the Nagoya Protocol, which many in our sector will be familiar with. We'll then discuss what expectations the CBD has for UK biotech companies, large and small, to contribute to the fund, what companies who want to contribute can expect, and also importantly touch on some of the outstanding questions and complexities of the fund. There is then time for questions from the audience, so you're very much encouraged to use the Q&A function to engage with the panelists and ask any questions if you have. So now over to you, Katie and Bart.
Wonderful. I will progress the slides about the speakers. We've had the introduction. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bart. Good afternoon at 1 minute past 12. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here. Yep, I'm really excited about just talking a little bit through some of the work that we've been doing on digital sequence information and where we are with the decision. I know that some of this might not be of direct relevance. No, not direct relevance. Some of this might be a new topic for you. So we will try our best to not to use too much jargon. I think we just slipped past a slide, which I was going to do a quick introduction to myself. So maybe we just skip back one quickly. That would be great. My name is Katie Beckett. I work within the Department for Environment for the UK government. I've been working on access and benefit sharing issues for a long time across the Nagoya Protocol, but also more recently on digital sequence information from genetic resources. And that included the negotiations which happened at recent Convention on Biological Diversity meetings. And now the implementation is now parties' turn towards how we will implement the decision. Great, thanks, Bart. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any slides moving on.
Have they not moved to decision 15.9?
No, I'm still seeing a picture of me.
You can see the 59. Oh dear.
Oh, there we go. They are moving. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So before I dived into the most recent developments at the Convention on Biological Diversity's 16th meeting of the parties, I wanted to quickly start with actually going back. So going back a little bit in time to the 15th meeting of the parties, and that is what we call COP15. So if you hear me refer to COP15 or COP16, I'm talking about the 15th and the 16th meeting of the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And at the 15th meeting, there was a couple of big steps forward were taken. First of all, parties agreed that benefits should be shared from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources, and that they also established a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism to do that, including a global fund. But despite establishing those, we didn't put in place any of the details behind it. It was really just a structure. So we knew that we wanted to set up a multilateral mechanism, and we also knew that that mechanism would include a global fund. And then in order to actually get to the details, we established a process as well. And that would be a fair, transparent, inclusive, participatory process that would take us up to CBD COP16, so the 16th meeting of the parties, where the ideas we would then agree the modalities for that multilateral mechanism. And also to do that, we established an ad hoc technical expert group, or an ad hoc open-ended working group, I should say, on benefit sharing. And that's where parties came together to discuss in great detail over an extended period of time what those modalities could look like. There was also a series of informal working groups happening as well. So we had an informal advisory group that ran through that intersessional process up to COP16, and that included parties, but that also included stakeholders. So the private sector played a big role in those discussions too. So I think the point that I'm trying to make essentially is that at COP15, we established a mechanism, and we established a really detailed process to work out what those modalities should look like, working through a variety of options before we got to COP16 in order to adopt them. Next slide, please, Bart.
COP16.
On to COP16.
Has it changed for you? Yeah.
Maybe mine's just moving a bit more slowly. If it's changed for you,
It's changed, yeah.
It's changed for you? Okay, great. So COP16 was in Cali, in Colombia, in November last year. In some ways, it feels like a lifetime ago. In some ways, it feels like it was just yesterday. And that's where the DSI discussions continued. So at that point, we reached an agreement on the modalities of the multilateral mechanism. The presidency was Colombia, so you can see in some of the pictures, some of the work that was ongoing to give you a bit of a feel for what a COP looks like. We have these big open plenary sessions where we do some of the negotiations. We do some of the negotiations in much smaller groups or in much smaller rooms. And that is the president, I guess, at the very end of the COP when the final decision was met. That decision is where we agreed the modalities and the details of those modalities and how we will go about implementing the DSI decision. So what the global fund would look like, which is now called the Cali Fund, and what parties are expected to do in order to implement that, what kind of measures they're expected to take. And I think if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to take you through a little bit of what that multilateral mechanism looks like. Give me the thumbs up again because I'm still seeing the previous slides.
Good.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
I've switched it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this is something that I drew up actually while I was watching my children in soft play. So please just take it as detailed as that. But I think it's helpful in just providing a bit of a visual representation. I'm not suggesting this is entirely accurate. There's parts in here which are not entirely accurate, but I think it helps us understand how the multilateral mechanism works. So if you look up at the top, you see what we've got biodiversity up there. From biodiversity, we have digital sequence information. So that is the genetic representation of nature, of those plants, animals, microbes, fungi, whatever they are. That is a genetic representation. So it's the sequence code, the genetic sequence code. That genetic sequence code goes into databases online. There are some private databases, but we also know that there are big open access databases that anyone can use. Users of those databases can access that data. They might use that data for the development of products or services. They might place those products or services on the market, and they might make a profit from those. And for that reason, parties agreed to establish this multilateral benefit sharing mechanism to ensure that the benefits that were accrued from the use of that digital sequence information could flow back to the custodians of nature, so Indigenous peoples and local communities, and support the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. So if we move down onto the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that where users are using that digital sequence information in the development of their products, the multilateral mechanism then starts to apply, so that they have the option of sharing monetary benefits, and those monetary benefits in the UK would be made on a voluntary basis into the Cali Fund. There's also an expectation that non-monetary benefits would be shared too. and that would all sit under the multilateral mechanism. The Cali Fund itself is housed within the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, which is a UN outfit. Have a look at the website, actually. There's loads of information on the Cali Fund on the website. You get loads of detail there. It's certainly worth a read. When users make a payment to the Cali Fund for the use of the digital sequence information, where the modalities state that contribution should be 1% of profit or 0.1% of revenue, they would receive a certificate. So that's where you see the certificate flowing back to the user to provide evidence that they'd made a contribution. They would also receive a receipt upon payment to the Cali Fund. The other part that is really important, which is what happens out the other side. So when the money is in the Cali Fund, we have no money in the Cali Fund yet, but once we do have money in the Cali Fund, that money will flow out the other side. Part of it will go directly to countries. There's an ad hoc technical expert group working now to develop a formula to work out how much each developing country will receive from the Cali Fund, and that will be based on level of biodiversity. It will be like richness. It will be based on capacity needs and development, and also their contributions of genetic information. The money will go directly to countries, and at least 50% of the Cali Fund will also go directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. The really important part as well is that the money that goes directly to the countries and to the Indigenous peoples and local communities is there to support the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's the 23 or 24 goals and targets of the framework, which was agreed by the parties to the CBD. It's almost like you're equivalent to the Paris Agreement that sets the targets globally. This sets the goals and targets globally for us to turn the tide, halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and then by 2050. So that global action plan, each country has a national biodiversity strategy and action plan, and the money that flows from the Cali Fund to those countries is to be ring-fenced in order to support the delivery of those national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Those actions, both by countries and by Indigenous peoples and local communities, will lead to the protection, ultimately, of biodiversity. So we come back round in that circle. The more biodiversity we therefore have, the more information that is available to be placed in the databases, and the more information, genetic information, that becomes available for companies to do their research and development. And then you see the cycle continues. So as I said, this is a representation of how it happens. I hope it's useful to kind of give you a picture in your mind of how the Cali Fund and the multilateral mechanism works. But I wouldn't hold this up. I wouldn't go off and maybe print this out and say that this is exactly accurate. For example, the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office should sit over the Cali Fund and not the multilateral mechanism whole. So there's a few little bits I would perhaps tweak, but hopefully it gives you a useful representation. Thanks, Bart.
Thanks, Katie. And so what I'll, against that wonderful overview and introduction, I think it was really clear, and you avoided so many acronyms, and in this world you could. I'll try to, pin it down a little bit more now, what it is that we are talking about from a company perspective. So for the purpose of this presentation, I just happen to have picked cosmetics, but I know that the membership of the BIA is very diverse. And I've just looked at some of the media in, the professional media in the cosmetics sector. So it mentioned companies, but I'm not picking on any specific companies. It's just to give you examples of what it is that we are talking about. So from a cosmetics perspective, or really any life sciences company perspective, it's fairly common to use non-human biological materials. And you can use them in their actual physical appearance, if you will. In the cosmetic sector, you may be sourcing traditional agreements, as you see there on the first slide here. Literally going out and collecting fragrances from flowers that made, or essential oils or what have you, that then are formulated into a fragrance or something else. But of course, as technology has advanced, what happens more and more is that you may have the genetic sequence or other information on the biochemistry of a certain interesting plant or what have you, or metabolite in nature, that you then genetically modify an organism, say E. coli, to express certain proteins or some other vector to express, and basically in the biotechnology sphere, still manufacture those ingredients, but then in a biovat. Or here you may, especially at the advent of AI over the last few years, let's take, for instance, that you have a huge database on molecules with fragrant properties, and suppose that you have a database and you train this to come up with new and interesting fragrances. There is, of course, still the distinction that Katie touched on. There is the, let's say, private databases in-house that you have developed, and public. That's an important distinction. But here, just to give you a feeling of what we are talking about. So what we are talking about with the Cali Fund is data on non-human materials out in the public domain. That's an essential background. Now, for memory, and Linda already mentioned this, of course, we have a whole set of access and benefit sharing rules already out there. The CBD from 1993 and the Nagoya Protocol entered into force in 2014 set out essential principles that say, okay, countries, they may require access, they may require some kind of permit, some kind of administrative procedure required when you acquire physical, non-human biological materials or genetic resources from their jurisdictions, and they may also require some kind of benefit sharing. So for instance, Brazil wasn't Nagoya party until 2021, but they've had access and benefit sharing laws since 2001, and essentially it's even in the Brazilian constitution. When you acquire or you conduct R&D on Brazilian genetic heritage, well, then you are expected to pay 1% on the final product back to Brazil. So that's a national ABS law. Depending on how you count, there are between 100 and 200 ABS regimes out there. I put the figure 100, which is at national level when we counted it 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But for instance, if you go to Argentina, they actually have 17 different ABS regimes. If you look at provincial level, in Belgium, Flanders doesn't have, Walloon does have. So in any case, the Nagoya Protocol from the early 2010s and focused, the understanding was at least on physical genetic resources. Now, as time progressed, the many national access and benefit sharing laws were seen to also cover digital sequence information. And I've colored them there in green, the ones that we are aware of. So Brazil, for instance, their definition of genetic heritage includes digital sequence information. So they're very explicit about that. The same with South Africa, the same with India, the same with Australia. That is not a Nagoya party, but a CBD party. Also in East Africa, Kenya, for instance, here, they also already include digital sequence information. And so that's an important one. So that's already the context that we are facing from a company perspective. All these national ABS laws, some of which also refer to information. And so from a business perspective, this is, of course, very challenging. We've always said and argued that this bilateral model, if you will, from the Nagoya Protocol, it's already difficult for physical materials and less than ideal. But when it comes to information, which is even more fluid and which may even not have countries of origin attached to it, the bilateral model really doesn't fit, because the value, well, because of the traceability issues that I mentioned, but especially with the advent of large data set, the value is not necessarily in any given particular snippet of information, but it may be in artificial constructs that draw on significant data sets of biological information. An additional challenge that we identified is exactly the fact that there are all these national laws, and then that there may be stacking, that it might be difficult to sort out who who exercises jurisdiction? What do you have to pay where? And that this has a negative impact on research and development and innovation. I've given this example already before, that I once was asked to work on a vaccine construct with more than 1,000 sequences that triggered more than 50 ABS laws, including physical, digital, public, non-public, etc. And then, you know, when I was asked what to do, like, well, it's impossible to comply with 50 ABS laws. So unfortunately, what the company did, they just deleted everything that would be a high risk in triggering ABS. But that's of course not the outcome, because that's a negative impact on the final product, negative impact on R&D. So there was, and I think still is, quite a lot of excitement with the Cali Fund, in the sense that this may be a truly multilateral, and by multilateral I mean above country model, to solve some of these issues. And this has, you know, certainly received strong support from business representatives. Now, since Katie included all these lovely photographs from COP 15 and 16, I thought I would include some from the business side as well. So I found this picture a nice one. We really sit in the back. So in these huge big rooms, I have found it sometimes challenging to be able to have our voices heard. And this is a late night photograph where we also sat in the back. This is a picture of me at an Meridian Inside event. Now, I think actually many of the EU representatives and Katie may have even been at that side event, but one of our frustrations from business has certainly been that these side events aren't always well attended. So sometimes we found it hard to get some of our business experience across in these discussions, but water under the bridge. I do think, you know, the steering committee, we've had the first steering committee of the Cali Fund last week, and even though there are only 2 observers from the business sector, I found it truly refreshing how we were allowed to speak just alongside all the member states. So that was really a good and forward-looking location. Maybe a little bit more detail on the Cali Fund itself. So unpacking decision 16.2. So if I draw your attention here to the left, it's essentially the invitation to pay. So it's not a legal obligation, it's an invitation to pay. Katie has already flagged this, is focused on users of digital sequence information on genetic resources in sectors that directly or indirectly benefit from its use in commercial activities. So this is an extract from paragraph 3 of decision COP 16.2. What exactly these terms mean, including DSI, has not been defined, and this has certainly been one of the pain points that industry has called out. But there has been preparatory work done. There is a recommendation that hasn't been formally adopted by an ad hoc technical working group in 2020 that essentially says DSI may comprise 3 groups. It may be at the level of DNA, RNA, so the order of nucleotides. It may be also information on amino acid sequences, on proteins, on protein folding, so that would be group 2, or it may be at the level of metabolites. Now, what it includes has not been defined. That may happen at COP 17 or 18, who knows, but it's certainly an ask from the sector to know exactly what it is that DSI covers. Now, an important one, if I draw your attention to the middle, there is in the annex to that decision, let's say, a presumption that this direct or indirect benefiting from the use of DSI is true for pharma, nutraceuticals, cosmetics, plant breeding, biotech, lab equipment, and information, including AI that draws on non-human biological materials. Now, that presumption can be rebutted. There is a paragraph about that in COP decision 16.2. Well, one of the points that industry is arguing towards negotiators is, well, if we don't define DSI, then we can't also rebut that presumption on benefiting or not from DSI. So that's one of the issues that is currently being discussed. Invitation to contribute, Katie mentioned this, 1% of global company profit or 0.1% on annual revenue. There is discussion whether these are indicative rates, whether lower payments are also accessible, how to calculate this. The expectation for the Cali Fund. Now, this is something, honestly, it isn't written down anywhere. It is partially drawing on studies, but I do think that there is a shared expectation of around, or at least a target eventually of getting to 1 billion euros a year or dollars a year in order to help filling the funding gap from biodiversity, drawing on private sector contributions. And this we're speaking to the UK here, but when I give a presentation like this, I always remind US companies, especially with global supply chains, that just because you're in the US and the CBD and they're not party to CBD does not mean this is not relevant to you. So the invitation is also extended to companies in non-parties, if you will. And then maybe a final slide. These are just two extracts that I took. So the BIA has made a submission with a number of key points that are truly shared across industry. The cosmetic the submission, the pharmaceutical sector as well. But this is already a very full slide, and I won't read everything. But maybe if I look at the BIA points and the fact that companies already contribute to biodiversity. This is something that many industries want to see emphasized. Clarification of terms. What does it mean to indirectly benefit across from use? And how does that play out across supply chains? That's a really big question for many companies. What if you are a business-to-business provider and you've made a payment? Does that then mean that your client who may use your, let's say, DSI generated cosmetic ingredient in a business to consumer relationship, does that company have to pay again or not? Or is this some kind of avoidance of double payment mechanism? Those kind of technical details are certainly not yet clear. Then the obligation of stacking, a big one, and maybe Katie can say a little bit more about that because there is some movement in that space. If you've paid into the Cali Fund, can you then somehow demonstrate or get legal certainty that, for instance, in Brazil, you don't have to pay anymore on Brazilian genetic heritage? So that's also a big query from the private sector, this legal certainty in the, let's say, international versus national level. Another one that is pharmaceuticals specific. Those of you who are active in infectious diseases may have heard that there is a new pathogen access and benefit sharing system under the World Health Organization. What if you've paid annual monetary contributions, which will be expected in that forum? Are you then still expected to pay also into Cali Fund or vice versa? What is the relationship between the International Plant Treaty and the Cali Fund? What is the relationship between the access and benefit sharing regime for marine genetic resources from the high seas and the Cali Fund? So those are things that are not yet clarified. And an important point as well, if I can here draw your attention, if you can see my pointer, is indeed transparency on let's say, efficient use of the funds. We know, of course, the UN Multi-Party Trust Fund, they publish a lot on their website, but there are some, especially publicly listed companies may require a higher standard of independent audits and the like to make sure that money that flows to IPLCs, indigenous peoples, or to countries has been used as efficiently as possible. So that is certainly a question from the private sector. And also, maybe I should highlight this one. In cosmetics, they've asked this explicitly as well. I don't recall if BIA has asked this, but an exclusion of SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, because, of course, in Europe and across Europe, 90% of companies are SMEs. Currently, the COP decision, the Cali Fund, focuses on large companies defined by 3 cumulative criteria, or 2 out of 3, based on how much revenue do you have, etc. But there may be then in COP17, which is around next October, November, a decision on whether or not to extend the invitation to SMEs as well. And I think the next slide is back to Katie. to give us a bit of insight into what is going to happen in the intersessional work between now and Armenia, where COP17 will take place. I've switched the slide already, Katie. I don't know if you can see it, but it's on the screen.
Great, thanks, Bart. Yeah, so on this slide, I put into buckets the main things that I think are going to take place between now and COP17 to give you a feeling for where the activities of work will sit. So the first one is on intersessional work, and that's the more kind of the formal work which will take place, which was requested by parties in the decision taken at COP16. So at COP16, parties requested the Secretariat to do some work. They also requested a few studies to be undertaken, and that information will then be gathered and presented back to parties as advice at COP17. So that includes some specific studies on, let me just pull them up, on national and international standards for identification of small and medium and large entities. They'll also commission a study on the contribution rate. So that's what Bart was referring to a moment ago, including the implications for revenue and generation. This information will be sent to the subsidiary body on implementation, which is an intersessional process as well. They will then provide advice to COP, and parties will come back and discuss some of these issues. So we have this quite kind of formal intersessional process, which is requested by parties. That also includes work by an ad hoc technical expert group, which will define a formula. And that's the formula that I referred to when I was talking about the diagram that will work out how much money goes from the fund to each individual developing country to support the implementation of the BSAP. So that will also be advice which is sent to parties for adoption at COP17, and that will work out how much money will be assigned to what countries based on the criteria or some of the leading kind of criteria which was within the COP16 decision. There's a couple of things that Bart referred to in a moment, which I will come back to, but I'll just keep going through these kind of main buckets in the meantime. Bart also talked about the steering committee. So that will be another kind of big focus now, right up to COP17 and beyond. That steering committee is made up of party representatives. So we have 3 representatives per region. That means that not all parties are represented. There has to be a limit on the size of a steering committee. I think that's quite important. Otherwise, I don't think it would be very effective in undertaking its work. And as Bart also mentioned, there are 2 representatives from the private sector within that steering committee as observers. They've had their first meeting, and I think the next meeting will be an in-person one just in a couple of months' time. They will also have a really important role to play in ensuring the transparency that Bart was referring to as well. So if there are some companies that feel that there's not the transparency that they need in the setup of the Cali Fund or what the Multi-Partner Trust Fund office can deliver, then I think that will be a really important role for the steering committee to tackle. We certainly don't want there to be barriers in place for companies to make contributions if things like the transparency of how that information about contributions is presented does not meet their requirements. So again, that's something that the steering committee could certainly be looking at. The other thing that I've got up here also refers to what Bart was talking about. So the Friends of the Cali Fund. This is a very new initiative. I worked with this with my colleague from Chile, my counterpart in Chile, to develop a proposal, an initiative to have a high ambition coalition of countries coming together to support the effective implementation of the Cali Fund. And this was born from many discussions that we had with private sector companies, both across Chile, across the UK, and more broadly. And through our engagement, one of the key messages that we kept hearing time and time again was one of the real challenges that was stopping contributions flowing into the Cali Fund was the obligation stacking risk. And when I talk about obligation stacking in this context, what I mean is that where there are potentially national access and benefit sharing measures, which also cover digital sequence information when that digital sequence information is within publicly accessible databases. And then we also have the multilateral mechanism. So there was concern from some companies that in some countries, if they access DSI, they would not know whether they should be sharing benefits through the multilateral mechanism or whether they should be sharing benefits through the bilateral mechanisms of individual countries. So this is what I refer to as stacking of obligations, the risk of duplicative payments. And we felt that we could do something about this. We felt that if we set up this coalition, brought countries together to form some kind of a declaration agreement, and this is still to be worked through, which says if you pay into the Cali Fund, if you've made your contribution to the Cali Fund, then you have is equivalent to have demonstrated compliance with national measures that cover digital sequence information in those publicly accessible databases. And therefore you have no expectation for that particular country to be paying through domestic measures as well. And it provide the certainty and the assurances that businesses are really called for in order to allow them to make contributions to the Cali Fund. So we launched the Friends of the Cali Fund yesterday. During our Secretary of State of DEFRA launched it during London Climate Action Week at a Nature Action event. We have a small group of countries which have come together in this first moment to provide their support as founding members. So that includes UK and Chile. It also includes Colombia. It also includes the Netherlands, Germany, and Norway. And this group will grow. We're having lots of conversations with other countries as well. And the idea is that over time, ideally, we would have all parties to the CBD. Over time, this group will grow and it will provide those assurances. The other point that Bart raised, which I think is really important, is this concern of stacking obligations across international forums. So Bart referred to the pathogen access and benefit sharing system of the pandemic Accord, also the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, and we also have the Agreement on Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. All of those international agreements address digital sequence information on the relevant genetic resources from which they cover. This is another area, another risk area of stacking obligations. But what I would like to say is that in Decision 16/2, parties were very, very strong to say that they would not support any stacking obligations across multilateral forums, across those different international forums. That is very clear in a few of the paragraphs actually within the decision. The complication is exactly how to do that. It's easier in the UK because the UK has said that this is a voluntary mechanism. So if a company is paying into the Pandemic Accord system, into the pathogen access and benefit sharing system for their use of digital sequence information and sharing benefits through that route, they have the choice that they don't have to make and share benefits through the Cali Fund as well. It might not be as clear in other countries if other countries adopt different approaches, but under the UK's approach, then the voluntary system allows those companies to make the choice as to where they share the benefits in line with their company practices. The other points on this, so the lower half of this slide. So I've got international moments to raise awareness and profile. I think this is really important. We speak to a lot of companies, but there's a lot of companies out there that are using digital sequence information in a whole range of sectors. It is right that there are sectors listed within the annex or the enclosure of the decision, but the real point is that users can be based anywhere. They can be based in any sector. What determines whether a company is going to be contributing to the Cali Fund or not, beyond the thresholds that Bart referred to, is whether they're using digital sequence information and in their business practices. It's not whether they're necessarily in the pharmaceutical sector or the biotech sector or whether in the plant breeding sector. It's whether they're using digital sequence information. So we have a lot of awareness raising to do. And I think there's various different moments throughout the calendar, throughout the international calendar, and throughout activities happening within the UK where we can work with those companies to help them understand, build awareness, and promote the Cali Fund as well. And I really call on you as well. I mean, you all have, I presume most of you at least have supply chains. You'll be working with other companies up and down your supply chains across your networks. And we really call on the community to raise awareness of the Cali Fund and the multilateral mechanism and what we're trying to achieve by closing the biodiversity finance gap. And by doing that, that brings me nicely onto the next bucket, which is allowing finance to flow. And that's really the next stage. We have the Cali Fund. It's been launched. It's there. Countries are beginning to step forward now to demonstrate their commitment to that multilateral mechanism, including through the Friends of the Cali Fund. And now we need to build the trust. We need to really build the trust between the private sector and between the countries that will be receiving the benefits. And we need to see the money to start flowing. So really that is a bit of a call to action. The other call to action is that to do this, I really think we need industry champions. I really think that we need industry players who can speak the right language, not always just the negotiators or the governments, but actually those CEOs of companies that can step up and take a leadership role and demonstrate their commitment to sharing benefits as well. So we are on the hunt. We are on the lookout for industry champions. We looked at that. We discussed that during the event yesterday in London where we launched the Friends of the Cali Fund. And again, I would put a call out if there's any companies out there that think that they might be in a leadership role and would like to play a role like that, then please do reach out. We'd really love to hear from you. I'll stop there, and Bart, back to you for the slides. Thanks.
Well, I think we can, I mean, we've covered everything in this slide. I think that there is indeed a lot of work going on for the public and the private sector to come closer on what the Cali Fund can be. So there's a lot of work to be done. But the next slide is discussion and Q&A, Linda. So maybe I'll just stop sharing and then over to Linda to manage. I don't think we can see whether there have been questions or
You can see them,
I'll let
yeah.
over to Linda. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both.
Stop sharing.
It's clear that there's a lot going on at the CBD and a lot of work continues to operationalize the fund. So I would like to address some of the outstanding points being discussed to operationalize this decision practically. And we have gotten some questions already from the audience around payments as well as the scope of DSI use. So I'd quite like to cover how companies determine what revenue or profits derive from DSI specifically. So how they calculate or assess whether a contribution is triggered in the sense that it is invited, and the sub-question around that on what's the situation for affiliates of a company whose revenues are taken as a basis, or if a company has many subsidiaries, who pays in the parent company, subsidiary company. So some very specific questions around that.
Who goes first? Katie, maybe you go first on this one.
Well,
it's a difficult one.
It is a difficult one, and I'm not sure there's going to be a very, very clear answer. So I think what I will do is like point towards paragraph 3 of the decision itself, and it's in the annex, paragraph 3 of the annex. So if I just read out some of that, then I think that might help kind of set the scene a little bit in the context in which we're working in. So users of digital sequence information on genetic resources in sectors that directly or indirectly benefit from its use in their commercial activities should contribute a proportion of their profits or revenue to a global fund according to their size, having regard to, you don't need that bit, entities that on their balance sheet exceed at least of the 2 of the 3 thresholds that Bart was referring to. So in answer to the question, like how do you work out the proportion of your company, that would mean whether you meet those thresholds. The decision itself talks about really that company size being the company as a whole. So you don't need to work out whether the amount that your company generates from the use of digital sequence information and therefore the selling of the resulting products meet those thresholds. It's the company as a whole which would meet those thresholds and then determine whether contributions would be expected. There is a word in there that refers to entities as well. So it might be that some companies could look at specific entities within them, and that would be another way perhaps of working out contributions. But really, the decision as it's written refers to the company as a whole in terms of its size. Bart, anything else to add?
Yeah, maybe, of course, a lawyer being a lawyer, right? I will. So from a business perspective, it's exactly right that, look, COP decision 16.2 being a, let's say, political non-binding decision between 196 countries, it doesn't have some of the details that you'd expect to see even in a binding instrument or a piece of legislation at EU or national UK level. A couple of industry concerns are certainly that determining your use of DSI is difficult, assuming that you already know what DSI is. I remember having conversations with R&D teams, and people who are in the thick of it told me, but saying that you use DSI is like saying that you use the alphabet to write. Of course we use the alphabet. We use it everywhere. Self-evident. Is that what we're paying for? Are we paying for the use of the alphabet or for something else? If you look at paragraph 3, and also if you align it with the CPT and the Nagoya protocol, the way that I look at it is you're not actually invited to contribute for using the alphabet, but it's rather about benefiting from the unique properties, if you will, of nature. That somehow there is a unique contribution of nature one way or another to a product that somehow creates commercial returns from which you are expected to then pay a certain percentage. Now, how to determine that? A big sticking point for companies is, of course, that to some degree that will be a trade secret. Certainly in cosmetic sectors, giving the exact detail of how you've manufactured and how you've formulated a product is not public domain knowledge. And so a demand that I have seen is in some of the submissions, since it's voluntary, that companies would be allowed, if they decide to contribute, to make that contribution or to make that calculation, taking into account some key principles that can be decided at international level, but that in the end, every company will have to make that determination for themselves. But so yes, there is no clear calculation formula out there, at least as of yet.
Thank you both. Yeah, certainly still one of the outstanding questions, and I think something that CBD is looking at or continuing to look at and grapple with, certainly in named companies. We have some questions around DSI and the scope of DSI. I'm going to group some of them together. So there are questions around the geographic origin of sequences. So does it matter under this mechanism where the DSI is from? Similar, does it matter where you got the DSI from? So if you got it from a US database that isn't part of the CBD, does that trigger a voluntary contribution? And Liz, also around DSI, does it cover human DSI and viral DNA? So kind of a set of 3 all around DSI.
I'm happy to start off, and then Bart, you can perhaps come in. So no, it doesn't matter where the digital sequence information came from. And that's almost the beauty of the multilateral system. So we know that there's challenges with the bilateral approach of the Nagoya protocol in working out exactly where the genetic resource came from and then putting in place a bilateral agreement. And parties and actually businesses for a long time have called for a multilateral mechanism. So there was a strong push right before COP15 to ensure that this was a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, rather than including digital sequence information within the scope of the Nagoya protocol, which at one point was also kind of on the table as another approach to take. So no, it doesn't matter where the digital sequence information came from. In fact, when you actually, and many like researchers have done this, they've like looked at where all the DSI is being uploaded from. And at the moment, the UK is running, I think it's called the Darwin Tree of Life program, where we're sequencing the 70,000 species, I think, in the UK, and uploading that DSI, that digital sequence information, that genetic information, onto public databases. So in the world, as of definitely a couple of months ago, the UK was the biggest contributor of digital sequence information to the databases. The UK has no interest in being the biggest recipient of benefits from the Cali Fund or from the multilateral mechanism. So it's just to reiterate and kind of illustrate the point that no, it doesn't matter where the DSI comes from. It doesn't matter who the country was that the genetic resource kind of originated from, in order to share benefits in the Cali Fund. The whole point is that we don't have to track and trace the origin of that digital sequence information. What I should say also is that there are some countries that do want to ensure that benefits are shared directly from the use of their digital sequence information, and that in some cases that DSI might be tagged within those databases. This is exactly the issue that the Friends of the Cali Fund is trying to address, to say that if you pay into the Cali Fund, if you pay through the multilateral mechanism, then you do not have to stack obligations and pay through the bilateral approaches as well if they exist. Is human genetic resources, digital sequence information on human genetic resources in scope? No, human genetic material is not in scope of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It never has been, it never will be. And it is very clear that human digital sequence information is not in scope of the CBD. Pathogens, on the other hand, might be, for example, but human genetic resources, human genetic material is not in scope of the CBD. Bart?
No, you've covered everything, I think. Maybe I will just give you a quick example of I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen, Linda? So this is just something for the audience. Is my screen stopped sharing? I think screen share here. So this is something that I come across quickly, like often the GenBank, which hosted here on a US government website, but as a collaboration between the UK, Japan, the US, is one of the largest databases out there. And if I here simply click nucleotide India and click search, then you see a huge amount of entries, right? So viruses, bacteria. So you can actually find pathogens covered here that may fall under the Cali Fund or not. And if you click India, then you will see here, what is this? Mung bean, yellow mosaic, India virus, isolate, etc. So for the Cali Fund, it doesn't matter. But one of the difficulties is, of course, that the Indian ABS law, especially with its latest amendment in 2024, does say it applies to DSI. It applies to DSI that is from India in whatever database you find it. So I'm paraphrasing here, but that's essentially what the language comes down to. And they say, for instance, if you apply for a patent on Indian digital sequence information anywhere in the world, you're expected to seek a permit from the Indian National Biodiversity Authority. So it doesn't matter for the Cali Fund, but it still matters for national ABS laws. And I can only hope that maybe India joins the Friends of the Cali Fund as well, and other highly biodiverse countries, which would certainly strengthen that initiative. So for now, unresolved, and it still matters, but let's see what the future in the intersessional brings.
And just to complement that, and hopefully provide some reassurance, I mean, that's absolutely our intention. We need those countries to join the Friends of the Cali Fund in order for it to be effective. It has to be the countries that have got those bilateral measures in place, that join up and agree that the multilateral mechanism for the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources, when that DSI is in publicly accessible databases, is the multilateral mechanism is the benefit sharing mechanism. But I do think I just want to be clear that what we're not suggesting is that digital sequence information, which might result from utilization of genetic resource, that could still be under a bilateral measure because somebody's accessed a genetic resource and therefore it's in scope of the Nagoya Protocol. What the Friends of the Cali Fund is trying to address is where that DSI is publicly available in the publicly accessible databases. And at that point, the shift happens over to the multilateral mechanism. But yeah, absolutely. I will be talking with my good friends in India very soon.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And I will not get into a discussion about the meaning of utilization under India's law. Because they would cover anyway, sequencing.
We need a whole other webinar for that one. I have two main things of questions that I want to group together. That one is around motivations to contribute. So that's the discussions that have been taking place in industry, but also at CBD around the incentives that are being set. As we know, the fund is voluntary. There's no obligation to contribute, but obviously companies are very much invited and by the CBD, somewhat expected to contribute. So other than publicity or other motivations that companies have, what are some of the incentives to contribute? For example, we have one attendee ask, will it be will the contribution be recognized in PAS 440/2020, so as a responsible innovation standard, for example, and things like that. So I'd like to cover that for a little bit, as well as before moving into what happens with the money afterwards. Who wants to take those?
You want to go first this time, Bart? I don't know.
Yeah, incentives. I tend to be the skeptical voice in the room there. Look, publicity, what I try to warn our colleagues on the public sector side, as well as our academics, is that the elephant in the room is that the current geopolitical circumstance, the world is what it is, and that especially with the current US government, it's not necessarily seen as a positive to be very active on ESG related topics. And so recently, this is a term that I first heard at a large US client, is called green hushing. And I hadn't heard it before, but it basically means doing the right thing, but not talking about it. And so I think there are very many companies that are doing the right thing or want to do the right thing, because after all, companies are not faceless legal entities, they are people. But the benefit of just being seen to be paying to a new global biodiversity fund from a reputational perspective, in the last few is not, shouldn't be overestimated, let's say. I think that's certainly one, and which is why initiatives such as the Friends of the Cali Fund, whereby in essence if you contribute, you also buy full compliance, basically make it a cost of doing business, so that the compliance nightmare that the Nagoya Protocol generates would be no longer there. I think that is a huge initiative, incentive, or would be a huge incentive. But then again, I'm a lawyer, and yeah, I know on responsible innovation, in the EU corporate sustainability reporting, etc. CBD, biodiversity, and ABS is part of it. I don't know if that's an incentive, but so yeah, ask a lawyer what's an incentive, legal certainty. So can't help myself there. Katie?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I think legal certainty is like, yeah, that's absolutely critical. And through this, like, Friends of the Cali Fund, as you referred to as well, I feel like I'm harping on a lot about it, but it feels like it does offer like a few of the solutions. That is exactly what that's trying to do. So provide the assurances and the certainty that if you pay through the Cali Fund, you don't have that stacking of obligations across other or across bilateral measures. So that's certainly part of it. I think that would be a strong incentive. I also think we need to really work with the business community to understand what the business case needs to look like in order for it to be, but in order to get like the C-suites on board, to take it up to the boardroom, to get the CEOs to sign off those contributions. Because every conversation that I'm having at the moment is that the business case is just not quite there yet. And I think it's up for industry to help us understand what's missing from that picture as well. From some of the conversations that I was having yesterday across different sectors with different businesses, and mainly at CEO level, was that if the business case is right, then the percentage doesn't really matter so much. If the business case is not right and the business case is not there, then no matter what size the percentage is, those contributions will still not be made. So it feels like that business case, those incentives need to be really worked through in order to see those finances begin to flow. And it doesn't feel like the messaging, which I have time and time again with the businesses, that just because we need to stop biodiversity loss, because we need to solve that biodiversity and that climate crisis, because Indigenous peoples and local communities are the custodians of biodiversity, and they need the help from the private sector in order to address that loss of biodiversity and in order to halt and reverse it. That feels, from the conversations that I've been having, is not enough to get that business case over the line. So I think it would be really helpful, it'd be super helpful from my side particularly, to work with industry to really understand what does a business case need to really address if we are managing to get it through those boardrooms effectively. And I think part of that picture, part of that message is, well, what happens to the money coming out the other side? And I did touch on that a little bit when I spoke about, when I showed that, that diagram or that kind of visual earlier. Well, that money goes directly back to countries, developing countries, for the implementation of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Those NBSAPs, they go directly to contribute to the achievement of the global biodiversity framework, the goals and targets of that framework, which been agreed at COP15 by 196 parties to the CBD, that these are the things that we need to do collectively if we're going to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So I think there's part of the message is like, what does biodiversity also mean to those companies? What part does nature play in your business models? What if there was not access to this nature anymore, or the biodiversity didn't exist? How would that impact your business? And therefore, is there a business case? Is there a story to tell in providing that finance, which goes back to protect biodiversity in order for your business to operate and be the best it can be? So I think it would be great to kind of work through some of those challenges with you, but I'm not sure we have the answers yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, there's definitely a big a gap in understanding, I think, mutual side of the business case, but also on the other side of the CBDs, its functioning and what the expectations are to bridge that gap. So we are out of time. So thank you very much, both of you, for attending the webinar. Thank you everybody calling in and for joining us for this important discussion. Just share a bit of my screen for the end bit. If there are any more questions, I see a few more questions in the chat that haven't been answered. Please do email me directly. I can put you in touch, but also answer a lot of these questions that are outstanding. Some of our upcoming events, if you're interested in connecting with the industry, please do come along, especially our summer party next week. That should be a good fun. If you are not a member yet and you really want to engage in these discussions and others, there are opportunities to join. You can learn more on our website to do so. And yeah, just generally, thank you very much for joining this webinar today. And yeah, we'll hope that we'll continue these discussions, work closely with industry and together, yeah, see where this fund goes and how we can bridge some of these gaps. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bart and Katie, for joining us.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Bye.